Good evening and welcome to the sixth presentation for the 2023-24 season of Avalanche Canada's webinar series. Happy New Year, and we're excited to continue to share some great presentations with you this season. My name is Brent Strand. I'm the producer for the evening. Amy Irving's in the background as our moderator, and she's going to be looking for your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you for joining us tonight, folks. For 3 years now, we've presented a variety of webinars and found that being online means we get to share our Avalanche safety messaging with even more of you than before. We're stoked that you're with us this evening, and we'd love to see that you share these webinars with others throughout the winter. Our mission is to help educate backcountry users to get out and play safe. We want you to know more, go further, and come home. First of all, we'd like to acknowledge that our session is being hosted in the territory of 4 nations, the Sinixt, the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, and the Syilx. As a national organization, we also acknowledge First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations whose lands we live and recreate on. So before we start tonight's session, we'd love to thank our sponsors. We have a whole bunch of government partners that help us out, our affiliated sponsors, our program partners, and premier and supporting sponsors. And then we have our contributors also that help us out. So this webinar is sponsored by the North Face. The North Face has supported public avalanche safety in Canada for over 20 years. And in that time, they've provided more than $100,000 to help keep people safe in the backcountry. We're very grateful for their ongoing commitment to Avalanche Canada and excited for what the partnership has in store for us in the future. So first off, I'd just like to talk a little bit about some housekeeping rules. Everybody is muted automatically. There's going to be opportunities to ask questions. To do so, it's great if you click your raise hand button, and then we have that verbal interaction between you and the presenter. Otherwise, you can hide behind that keyboard, go in the Q&A box. It's found at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that, type your questions in there, and then we'll pose those to the presenters. Please don't use the chat box for those questions. The chat box, we're going to be using that for sharing web links and information that's coming direct from us out to you as the end audience. And also stick around at the end because there's going to be some prizes sponsored by North Face. So tonight's presentation, using the mountain weather forecast. The mountain weather forecast is a powerful tool. Understanding weather helps us understand the near or long-term snowpack issues, and thus it helps us understand avalanche conditions. Forecasters look at the weather every day to help them assess the snowpack and potential avalanche problems. This webinar is designed to help you understand how to use the mountain weather forecast effectively and to help you plan your backcountry adventures to maximize both your fun and your safety. So tonight, our presenters this evening are Ross MacDonald, an operational meteorologist from Environment Canada, and Simon Horton from Avalanche Canada. Ross is one of the weather experts who helps create the daily mountain forecast found on Avalanche Canada's website. Simon is an avalanche forecaster and also our research officer. Both Simon and Ross love to explore the backcountry, and tonight they will share some tips on how to get the most out of this amazing tool. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to them, and I hope you folks enjoy the presentation tonight.
Super awesome introduction there. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to share my screen and we can get started here. So maybe I can get a thumbs up if I am showing the right screen.
Yes, you are. Looks good there, Ross.
Thank you very much there. Okay, so yeah, no, it's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening. Simon and I are here to give a nice talk on mountain weather and mountain weather forecasting and its impact on avalanche forecasting. So kind of tackling this from both angles. I'm more of kind of the weather side of things, and then Simon will be kind of more the avalanche side of things. So I'm an operational forecaster, and I've been with Environment Canada for nearly 2 decades. Forecasting in British Columbia for the majority of it, a little bit in Edmonton as well. And I've been associated with the mountain weather forecast since its inception. Since its evolution, as we'll see, it's gone through some evolutions, but in its current form, a nice blog format and lots of wonderful graphics. It's been in that kind of evolutionary form since about 2015. So I've been doing that and been involved with the not only the production of it, but also but developing some of the tools and some of the look and feel as well. So that's kind of my background, and I'll let Simon introduce him as well.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks, Ross. I'm Simon. I'm calling in from Kimberley, BC today. I've been forecaster with Avalanche Canada for 8 seasons, and I'll talk a lot about the importance of weather and that work. And also, as a researcher with the SFU program, I work quite a bit with weather forecast models and looking at how we can use them to better forecast avalanches. So I'm quite interested in this topic too. Thanks, Ross.
Nice. So the first thing we're going to do is we're gonna get you guys involved because I don't want to talk. Simon doesn't want to talk all the time. We want to get some participation here as much as we can virtually. So we're going to poll the audience with the first question. We have a couple. The first one being, what's your main winter sport? I'm kind of curious to know the audience that we're speaking to here. So what is your main winter sport? And I think a pop-up is going to come up here, and you'll be able to select what you enjoy doing, or one of the things you enjoy doing. Maybe you like them all. So now I guess we'll just give about a minute or so. I myself, I do a lot of, I'd say more the skiing aspect, but I'm also fairly big, especially in the summertime, a big outdoor enthusiast as well. So a lot of backcountry hiking for me in both seasons. Sweet, nice. So we got lots of backcountry skiers, but some snowshoers, awesome, and snowmobilers and ice climbers too. Fantastic. So awesome. Second question, what is your level of avalanche training? So there's a few options here. You can be totally new to the game, and that's awesome. This is all a great opportunity to learn and educate yourself. That's what we're here for. But if you're more experienced too, that's awesome. So yeah, nice. A little potpourri, nice. So we got a fair amount of folks who've got some training, and especially with the AST 1 or 2. And a few new folks as well, which is great. So welcome all. Awesome. So whether you're kind of new to things, or you're very, very experienced, having a successful day obviously depends on a lot of things. And it's not just understanding the forecast, but to make sure that you look at, say, all of your relevant variables and things such as precipitation, temperature, as we are, if we're all in British Columbia or even in Alberta, if you're joining from really any part of Western Canada, the temperatures are about to be a little chilly for the first time this season. Cloud visibility and wind, any of these elements can, depending on how what you encounter, may end up turning you around. So good to know the forecast. And so we'll talk a little bit about this. So where are we going? And I actually haven't said it yet, but this presentation was actually made up by our lead, Avalanche Mountain Weather Forecast lead here at Environment Canada, Lisa Irvin, and she can't be with us today. So again, Simon and I have kind of stepped in to give the talk there. She's under the weather with hopefully recovering soon. But so this is a wonderful talk presented or pre-created by her, and so we're gonna step through, I guess, the ins and outs of mountain weather forecasting, and a little bit about the product, how to interpret it, and then Simon's going to step through maybe a daily process to look at of how you maybe prepare for a day in the backcountry as well. But before we wanted to get into just a bit of the history, and part of this is the joy of actually kind of speaking to all of you directly here. And I'm sure Simon feels the same way, that, so often in organizations, you maybe lose the human aspect of that, these are all created by people, and people all have a lot of stories and experience and background. And it does take a team to do these sorts of things. So we really wanted just to share a bit of a collage, at least on both sides of things, with the Environment Canada, the Weather Office, where the Mountain Weather Forecast is created, and it's the forecast office in Vancouver, and then some of the Avalanche Canada forecasters who put together your Avalanche Canada forecast. So, and I have to say too, the Avalanche Canada forecast and the Mountain Weather Forecast, it's evolved to look at not just say British Columbia, but we're doing little bits of the Alberta side of the Rockies. We're doing parts of the southern Yukon as well near White Pass. So it's gotten bigger. It's evolved since it started this at least in this incarnation in 2015. And so actually some of the forecasters you see here are right. Actually, some are from Edmonton, some are from Winnipeg, who help do a bit of writing as well. So a wonderful team of meteorologists shown here. And Simon, maybe you can say a few words about the Avalanche Canada forecasters too.
Yeah, thanks. So most of the forecasters are based in the main office in Revelstoke, and there's a few others in different areas as well. And we really work closely with the professional meteorologists at Environment Canada to produce our daily forecast for avalanche conditions. Because to get an accurate avalanche forecast, there's kind of two main inputs. You need to have a good understanding of the snow that's on the ground, and that really comes from field observations. But just as equally important is understanding the weather forecast and how that's going to impact the snow. And so over the years, we've always had really good interagency discussions with professional meteorologists. And in its current form, a lot of the outputs of those discussions now get put into this product where anyone in the public can read about the kinds of mountain weather considerations that are happening in the backcountry.
Yeah, no, it's a great collaboration. So as we'll get into it, this is a forecast that's produced daily, and it's 365, so every day, and including with this, at least with Avalanche Canada and Environment Canada, we do a daily collaboration as well. Fine tune some of the things that may be some uncertainty, some questions that may come about. The weather is not always certain, as we know. So we try to provide as much information and good collaboration as we can. It's a wonderful relationship. So on the weather side of things, putting together a forecast involves a few ingredients, if you will. It involves a lot of looking at data, and we love data at the Weather Office. We can never get enough of it. And looking at particularly at real data. And what's some of that real data? Well, a lot of satellites. The birds in the sky are getting more and more data, more and more, say, different fields to look at in terms of infrared, different channels of infrared visible. It's actually quite a lot of eye candy for the weather nerds. It's amazing what's out there now. Radar, we like to see what's going on, and radar helps support a lot of say what's happening in real time, and then surface observations, weather stations, whether they be human or human observed or manned in that sense, or as if they're automatic stations. So any kind of data, kind of ground truth, figure out what's happening. It hopefully will put us together, a good picture of what's happening. From there, we kind of move forward. We like to use some weather models as well. And there's a variety to choose from. Now in Canada, we have the GEM on the left here. And then I've also got the European ECMWF and the American GFS. There are others. We like to, and one of the questions that has common when I've done some of these in the past is, what is the best model? And the answer is none. There is no model of the day per se, really. Actually, we like to use all the models to help us kind of fine tune what the weather is going to be. So there is no particular, say, model of the day. Ideally, the models help us converge us into a solution. So if they're all kind of showing the same thing, say 3 days out, there's going to be a snowstorm for Vancouver, a snowstorm for Revelstoke, and all the models are agreeing, well, that's fantastic, where we can use all the models together to have a nice converging answer. Where sometimes the models may diverge, though, and that helps create that's what we would refer to maybe as some uncertainty. and we can delve into that further. So if there's multiple solutions that are being shown. And that's often the case. The weather never is maybe quite certain, especially as you push out further in time. But we do like to use the computer models, again, in concert with real-time data. But the real-time data can only work really within, say, the first 24 to 48 hours. So you put that all together with good meteorological theory that we learned in school, and presto changeo, you have a weather forecast. That's kind of the nuts and bolts of the weather. Obviously, there's a little bit more to that, but that's kind of the basic premise of things. You're trying to figure out what's happening now, use some of the computer models to help project it forward along with the real-time data, use that theory. So you got the what, the why, and then you project it forward and try to make a prognosis. And that's kind of the basics of weather forecasting there in a nutshell there. So I've got one more poll question for you. And now that we've been talking about it, do you use the mountain weather forecast? And I guess how often do you use it? And you'll make me happy if I see you use it every day. I check it every day. I don't go in the backcountry, but I would say too, as just a general weather discussion, it's a really good product that we put out at Environment Canada. We're really, actually, I would say a lot of the forecasters are quite proud of this particular product.
Hey, Ross, as we're waiting for the poll to happen here, we have a Mel in the chat box wondering, how is the model generated?
Yeah, so we have at least in Canada, we've got our supercomputer, which is in just outside of Montreal. And so it's run 4 times daily, and it takes into account a lot of the equations of motion, a lot of physics and thermodynamic equations. So very, very complicated physics and math equations go into it. They crunch the numbers and they roll them out into the future to see hopefully what it projects as being what the state of the atmosphere is at a current time. So it's generated by supercomputers and lots of thermodynamics and physics equations there. And I guess maybe just a supplement to that, because I know there are other questions with respect to models. With how the Canadian one, a lot of the equations of motions and those physics and thermodynamic equations, the Americans use it, the ECMWF in Europe uses it, UK Met, all sorts of models use pretty much the same equations. Where sometimes the difference in the models comes from is in the model resolution, how fine the resolution is in terms of capturing features. Some have higher resolutions than others. Some can have different physics, what we call physics packages, physical parameterizations, and that sort of thing. So some can capture features better than others. And so without going into a total numerical weather prediction presentation, which I could talk about, and that would be another hour on its own, but it's very much it's in terms of the resolution, in terms of different models, everyone is very similar in terms of those equations of motion, but just slightly different, maybe resolutions and parameterizations. I know that's a question that I've been asked in the past, so sorry for rambling on with that one.
Thank you, Ross.
You bet. So getting into the mountain weather forecast. Well, I'm glad some of you are reading, which is terrific. We do try to make it fun and entertaining, but we also try to make it pretty, at least describe the narrative very, very well in terms of the story. So if you go to the Avalanche Canada page and you select mountain weather forecast, this is kind of what you get on this page here. It's daily, or it's written daily by meteorologists with the focus on mountain weather, particularly during avalanche season. After May, as we switch kind of out of mountain weather season, we will sometimes have some other focuses, but we have kept it going right through the summer. So this is something you can read all year round if you'd like. It's got distinct sections for the BC coast, the BC interior, and then Alberta Rockies and White Pass. So we try to at least make sure we don't forget anyone. Talk about the high impact weather, talk about the weather story, and each region gets their own little section in the day 1 and day 2 tabs. So this particular one is Dawn Patrol. So up in here, so if you see created by, I don't know if we'll, it's just above synopsis, but you go to the very top there, you see created by. You've got some very cleverly written, I would say, pseudonyms. Dawn Patrol is actually Lisa. So spoiler, I don't know if I need to share that or not. If you see one written by Rossby Wave, that's me. So I've Rossby Wave being a long wave pattern in the atmosphere for any weather nerds who are interested anyways. So of course, if I can fit my name into a weather feature, of course I'm going to use it as a pseudonym on the Avalanche Canada blog. Moving on. So the blog is broken up into different components. There's the synopsis, which kind of talks really about the big picture, and we really try to hit on, the overall kind of the forest aspect of things. If it's the forest versus trees, this is certainly more of the forest idea of things. And we talk generally about the overall state of the weather and how things are progressing. And then below, we've got this animation, which isn't moving right now, but in the mountain weather forecast, there's a nice animation, which you'll be able to step through and see all the different features as they progress. And I think we go out 4 or 5 days with that particular animation. So the explanation for the animation is below, and it's described as a 500 millibar animation. And I should take a step back and just say 500 millibars, what is that? One thing we like to do in weather is we like to look at heights in the atmosphere with respect to pressure. And so 500 millibars really describes the atmosphere at about say 18,000 feet. It's a good kind of mid-level range of the atmosphere to describe the main flow pattern at upper levels and where those weather systems are coming from and where they're going to be impacting various parts of BC. It's something to the effect of the tighter we've got these kind of nice, well, actually, I think I've got it coming right up here. So I've zoomed in on it. And so those black lines, the tighter those lines, the faster the wind, I would say, at the faster the steering flow at that height of around 18,000 feet, and the faster those weather systems could come in. Whereas if we're focusing maybe down, well, and say off the coast of California, there's barely any flow down there. And so it's quite a bit of a call, a little bit of a calmer and not really any incoming weather there. But in this particular image, you've got a fairly tight packed black lines, weather kind of coming in from west to east, and so probably some strong winds associated with that. So yeah, 500 millibar geopotential heights is the technical name for those lines. So again, the closer together, that's kind of the stronger the flow pattern. And then we have something called the other kind of colored lines, which are dashed, 1,000 to 500 millibar thickness. So we're taking a layer of the atmosphere, 500 millibars, 18,000 feet. Now we've got 1,000, which is more or less at the surface. We're taking that thickness, and colder air, a little bit more dense than warm air, less dense. So colder air will see lower thicknesses. So that's a little bit packed thickness there, as opposed to warm air, which will have a much higher thickness. And so it's basically akin to temperature, which is what we're trying to do with that. So you see thickness, you can kind of relate it just to temperature. And in this image and in the animations, you'll see, say, if you look up, say, towards Alaska, you've got those purple dashed lines representing very low thicknesses, cold temperatures, which would make sense being in Alaska. And then if you go down and peek into, say, California or off the coast of California, You've got some of the orange dashed lines, so higher thickness, so generally warmer temperatures. It can at least tell you where the warmer or colder air masses are. And I suspect if you step through this morning's blog as well as the upcoming blogs, you'll probably see a few of the purple lines creeping into British Columbia, and some of those blue lines coming all the way down, certainly probably into Oregon State as well with this Arctic push. So just a little bit of how to maybe interpret that graphic. Again, the geopotential height lines, the solid black lines, kind of where the strongest winds are and where the strongest flow is, or when those lines are closer together, and it kind of steers the weather systems in. And the thickness lines kind of more akin to temperature. So you can read a little bit into that, a little bit of, hopefully I've explained it a little bit there. Whoops. So that's on the first page, kind of the big picture. Nice animation. Then we get into some of the more details, and this is kind of where your individual section comes up, whether you're looking particularly at the BC coast or whether you're looking at the interior, the Yukon or Alberta. You can find your section here, and it's got a nice image, kind of a weather map image showing where things are. It's usually just snapshots at roughly 4 a.m. and 4 p.m. Pacific time for each of the days, so day 1, day 2. And so if we look at the image a little bit bigger here, it's just it's a nice kind of snapshot on where things are, and it also picks out, say, maybe some where the snow is, where what the freezing levels particularly are, and freezing level is defined here as FL, and then some other annotations with, perhaps windy, maybe in a situation where there's valley cloud, we might have that, or sunshine and that sort of thing, maybe if it's a little bit less active per se. And then this particular one, we have a low pressure system kind of cutting through BC with the cold and the warm front, donated with the red line and the blue line respectively. And we've kind of got them annotated there as well with kind of the direction of where they're going. So, and then in addition, we've got the green, and similarly, I didn't mention it for the synopsis or the synopsis page, but that denotes precipitation. And so the heavier amounts would come up with darker greens or perhaps even yellows, and then the lighter greens is certainly lighter precipitation. And similarly to the synopsis, we've got the thickness lines on there. And again, that's more of akin to temperature. Again, that's a layer, 500 millibars, 1,000 millibars. A thicker or a smaller layer of thickness denotes colder temperatures with colder dense air. And again, warmer temperatures, usually the thicknesses are a bit higher. So that's kind of your day 1, day 2 kind of short range snapshot. Day 3, day 4, we also extend out to that. And this one actually comes with an animation. And the solid black line here are in mean sea level pressure. So it's different from the black lines that are on the synopsis page, just as a note. And so, and you're able to step forward through the day 3, day 4 period. And again, precipitation kind of in green there. And the thickness lines are on there as well. Again, akin to sort of the temperature. And then usually towards the beginning of the week, we like to do our day 5, day 7. So you've come back from the mountains and you've had a fantastic weekend, and you're like, man, I want to go again next weekend. Well, this is actually a nice forecast to look at. And of course, it is day 5 to day 7. So of course, the caveat being, the further we look out, a little bit more uncertainty, but we can look out, and it's a little bit more of a broader look at things, but this outlook is available Monday afternoon and on the Tuesday blog as well. And we'll usually be looking at longer range models. Sometimes we'll look at something called ensembles, and that's a collection again of models, not say just particular deterministic models like the GEM or the ECMWF or the GFS as we saw earlier, some of these are models that can be perturbated, and we have multiple solutions. And again, if the solutions are converging on something, we have more confidence. If there's divergence in those solutions, we have a little less confidence going forward. So we can look at that as well and give you maybe just a flavor for things to come. We're really good, I would say, day 5, day 7, looking at trends. But if you're saying there's going to be a particular snow event coming for the weekend, this is the maybe it's coming, but timing wise, sometimes it can maybe get a little bit faster, a little bit slower, and that's where it's always good to maybe check back with the forecast there. One thing that is really cool, and you can go back and maybe you've gone on a trip somewhere and you said, man, I got this weather, what was the weather pattern? The beauty of this is there is a massive archive, and I think it goes back to somewhere in the neighborhood of 2015 or 2016. I'm not sure if all the images work, because I know we've gone through various iterations of kind of evolving those images, but it's a fantastic resource. I would actually say on our side in operations, we sometimes look at them because they're a quick stopgap for even case studies. If you just want to have a quick look back and say, what on earth happened this day? It's a quick way to look at it. So across the date tab there, you can go back and select different months and different days. Again, going back probably about 7 or 8 years.
Excuse me, Ross. Just before you move on there.
Yeah.
I got a couple questions in the Q&A here.
Sure.
One person, Robert, is talking about the latest forecast. There appears to be a system labeled as L, which is presumably the low, and then moving to the north, and then yet in the subsequent pages, day 1, etc., it's an H. It turns into a high pressure. Can you help me understand this a little bit more? And at the same time, you mentioned the mean sea level pressure. How does that differ from the 500 millibar geo?
Yeah, okay, perfect. So let me, I'll do them in reverse, actually. Let's do that. So the mean sea level pressure is measured at the surface. So that's the pressure at the surface. And so if you've got areas of low pressure, as we'll see, say on the weather maps there, labeled as your correct L, those are surface areas of low pressure. And then the highs, labeled H's, are the surface areas of high pressure. And those are usually the maps too that, if you'll watch, say, some of the evening news, meteorologists, such as Christy Gordon or Joanna Wagstaff, Mark Madriga, they'll use them on their various weather graphics and that sort of thing. Where they differ with respect to the 500 millibar, again, mean sea level, and then the 500 millibars kind of about midway through the atmosphere or the troposphere, and really good for looking at the steering flow for weather systems. And so just because you've got, say, a low pressure area at the surface doesn't necessarily mean you're akin to have a low pressure area aloft as well. So oftentimes, and again, we'll go into too much of the meteorology of it, but they usually aren't aligned. They aren't usually stacked. So you won't necessarily have a low pressure area at the surface underneath the low pressure area aloft. There are situations where that happens. So if you're seeing the H at the surface appearing with perhaps an upper level area of low pressure is what we'll call it, an upper area of low pressure at, say, 500 millibars, it's not that's meteorologically correct. It's not a mislabel or anything like that.
I'm going to add one more in there, Ross. So the actual numbers associated with the solid lines in the beginning on the synopsis in the day 1, are those actual pressures at 18,000 feet?
So it's geopotential height. So it's a constant pressure, and then different. Again, without getting into too much of the details of the meteorology, it's basically everything's at 500 millibars, but they're different levels, I guess, of the different heights. And so it's well, I'm trying to show it on the screen here, but it's not easy, but it's basically the steering flow. And again, the tighter those lines are, traditionally the faster the flow. If those lines are a little bit further apart, the flow is much, much slower. They are all at 500 millibars, so that's the constant kind of pressure field that we're looking at that field. But they're called geopotential heights, and they're measured in decameters. There, usually around, say, in the 500s. But I won't go into too much more of the meteorology there of that. Okay, going into winter weather patterns, and there are a few to talk about. Now, what I'm going to show you here for each of them, we're going to go into 5 particular patterns. And we're going to show you basically an infrared satellite image on the left here. So we're going to start with that. And then we're going to show kind of the corresponding 500 millibar, again, mid-level in the troposphere, where the steering flow, where the atmosphere is directing the weather systems. Again, follow those lines kind of from west to east. And so I'm going to have that animation or that image in the middle. And then on the right, I'm going to have the corresponding surface pressure pattern. Again, the surface pressure pattern at the surface, again, maybe with L's for lows and H's for highs identified there. And just generally talking about the different kinds of weather associated and really maybe what you as and this is, maybe where you watching from home, and if you're building your own kind of like database in your head about what the weather is, the steering flow is it's kind of it's what we look at. It's what I look at to see if it's going to be a busy day, shall we say, if at the weather office. Because sometimes you can just have a quick look at the satellite or say the steering flow at 500 millibars, and you just know it's going to be this kind of weather or this kind of weather. And so we'll go into these different kind of patterns. And again, meteorologists, we like our patterns. We like our pattern recognition here. So the first one is just straight off. A lot of our weather systems in BC, the vast majority come in from west to east. They come in from the Pacific. And so this is what we call a westerly pattern, an active pattern, you may say. Zonal is another name that we use for this. So zonal, active pattern, westerly. This is kind of all the names that we'll have for it. So it's all weather systems that are basically coming in from the west. And, it's coming in from the Pacific. So it's from a region in terms of moisture of relatively mild air, but not too mild, as we'll see, but relatively mild. And packing some moisture, and usually the winds blowing from west to east aloft will help perhaps load snow onto those mountains, or at least precipitation, depending what the freezing levels are in the time of year, on the mountains on perhaps those more western facing slopes. So again, strong westerly winds. And it's, in terms of any precipitation breaks, sometimes this active weather pattern, we'll just say it's an active weather pattern. Perhaps the timing of these breaks can be tricky. It's one system just after another. Think October and November. It's the usual October, November. It can be a lot of storms. And just as the storms go by, sometimes you'll get into a little bit of warmer air, and then quickly a little bit slightly cooler air, and so it can fluctuate a little bit there too. So from the weather perspective, sometimes those breaks are really hard to predict in time with the system, which just an active weather pattern in that sense. So, and again, western facing slopes do get a fair amount of the snow. Simon was going to help with some of the impacts with these weather patterns on the potential avalanche conditions.
Thanks. I'll start by mentioning from like a skier or sledder's perspective, this is a good kind of flow. These are kind of the best ways to get big snowfalls like we've seen over the last week through the south half of BC. We've had a zonal westerly flow with active storms. So in terms of avalanches, what we get with that is big falls of snow, create storm slab problems, and kind of shorter periods of higher avalanche danger. Sometimes if it's an active pattern and we have a storm after storm, we can have sustained elevated danger like we have right now. But then generally once the flow pattern changes out of this, we generally see the avalanche danger start to go down after the snowing stops. One thing you sometimes see on these maps is that it drops a lot more snow on the coast range than in the interior, and it often catches your eye. But it's worth remembering that even though it's not brightly colored on the map, a moderate amount of precipitation in the interior can be enough to elevate the danger. For example, you might often see 100 millimeters of precipitation on the coast, and then only maybe 30 millimeters in the interior. But we'd have very similar avalanche conditions with that. They'll both be potentially high danger with quite dangerous conditions for people to have them in the backcountry.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. So again, on our side, and it leads to the challenges, timing and then amounts can always be a little bit challenging with this flow pattern. Let's pivot a little bit and tilt it. So we've gone westerly, but let's tilt it a little bit to the southwest and talk about what if we are into a southwesterly flow pattern for the province, and or even a southerly flow pattern. And you may know these as atmospheric rivers. Or perhaps if you may also know them by other names, the hurricane or the tropical punch, or pineapple express. I'm trying to think if there's other ones. I know if I search far enough in the internet, there's always some clever names, but they're kind of a catch-all for what it really is just an atmospheric river. And I just maybe step back and just say there's been a lot of talk of atmospheric rivers, especially since the 2021 event and really catastrophic atmospheric river, especially in the Fraser Valley and on the Coke. We've had atmospheric rivers since forever. The naming of them came around in the 90s, but it's really just been since, especially these catastrophic events of a couple of years ago, that they've really come into the vernacular, especially of the media. And so atmospheric rivers, especially on that magnitude, were catastrophic. Not all atmospheric rivers are bad, though. In fact, we need them. They transport moisture from the subtropics down near Hawaii up into our neck of the woods. And they are really actually essential for just loading our reservoirs and really transporting moisture up into BC. So it's in the events that some of the stronger ones can really be the ones that cause problems, and that was the case in 2021. But weak atmospheric rivers are actually somewhat beneficial. So I just want to maybe put that out there as well. Not all atmospheric rivers are bad, but given the events of 2021, when people do read and see the word atmospheric river, we have noticed, I would say, especially from the media perspective, that people do get concerned, and justifiably so, given the events of 2021. But this pattern is relatively common to see. We do get atmospheric rivers every winter, and we've had them this winter, and we may get a few more as the winter goes on. In particular, December was a month that was particularly warm, and we saw a lot of westerly and southwesterly flow patterns, and did see a lot of rain and high freezing levels associated with these. So flow pattern coming from the southwest, moist, warm. What's going to happen? Well, moderate to heavy precipitation, because it's a heck of a lot of moisture. They're piling up on the mountains, especially the west to southwesting slopes, but they are very high freezing levels. And I can only imagine, Simon, that this causes challenges when it comes to avalanche forecasting.
Yeah, so it's pretty dramatic, powerful weather. So they usually cause some kind of big spike in avalanche danger. It could be tricky, though, definitely with the freezing levels of whether we're seeing rain or snow. And above that rain line, we get copious amounts of snow. But also, depending on the snow that's on the ground, getting rain falling on that can still be tricky. And in general, with these flow patterns, we get a pretty short period of quite high avalanche danger. We have, on the danger rating scale, it goes up to 5, with the highest level being extreme, which is quite rare. It seems like maybe in Western Canada, some rains will get that once per year. And I would think if you went back and looked over the last few decades, most of the times that rating is used is associated with an atmospheric river, but kind of an extraordinary large one. The after effects of that are that with the warm, wet, heavy snow, it tends to bond quite quickly and danger can rebound and become lower quite quickly after these. They also will often create a big, thick rain crust that freezes potentially high into the mountains. The ones that occurred in early December have left a crust quite high in the mountains that's now buried across the southern half of Alberta and BC. And depending on what happens after the atmospheric river, that buried crust may or may not become a problem.
Nice. So yeah, so atmospheric rivers, it's it's one of the patterns that we see. And again, so if you see a south to southwesterly flow pattern, it is going to tap into some warmer air and some moisture there. So let's flip things around though and pivot and maybe turn 180 around and go to, say, a northerly or northeasterly flow pattern. And this is maybe focused more for, say, our friends on the Alberta side of things, although it can be on the BC side as well. But generally, it's more the Rockies that this kind of really hits home. And you get kind of a pattern where you're getting some upslope flow. And in particular, for, say, I'll focus on the image, say, on the right and our surface area of low pressure here, and warm front in the red and cold front in the blue, and air around a low pressure system is counterclockwise. So if you follow these lines, if you start for those of you who know your Alberta geography, it's like Fort McMurray or Fort Chipewyan or something, and follow those lines all the way to into British Columbia and to the Rockies. Well, you're getting some flow, at least at the surface, that's going to be piling up along the mountains, and you can get some enhanced amounts there. And these can be heavy snowmakers, for especially for the Rockies in these situations. So northeasterly, especially upslope flow, a pattern that we certainly try to keep an eye on for any potential heavy snow there. Again, it's sometimes maybe not the usual places that get the snow as well. Traditionally, a lot of the systems would dump, especially as they come in from the Pacific, as we've seen with the west or southwesterly patterns, they're going to pile on those snow, especially on the western facing slopes. This is a pattern where it can actually be a little bit different. It can be the opposite. So Simon, yeah, did you have anything to add for northeasterly upslope flow there?
Mainly that we get snowfall in spots we don't see it as often, and it's been nice in the last 2 years with the Avalanche Canada's flexible forecasting system. When we see these flow patterns, we can now better kind of identify and localize the danger to the eastern slopes of mountain ranges, most often the Rockies, but sometimes we do see it in like places like Smithers and Chilcoot and get this effect as well.
Nice. Well, let's go to the pattern that we're actually in right now. Probably the most pertinent, Arctic outbreak, and traditionally from more of a northerly flow pattern for us in BC. So we have a visible image actually now with the satellite on the left as opposed to the infrared on the right, or the previous flow patterns. So we have a visible showing what looks like especially across, say, the central interior BC up into the northern area BC, not a lot of clouds. So clear and cold, especially when Arctic air does settle in. Arctic air is particularly dry, so you're not going to have a whole heck of a lot of moisture generally associated with the air mass itself. But when it does interact with moisture along the coast, we can have some decent snow events, especially in the south coast. And this may actually be the case coming up as we start to see the Arctic air push down today, and will certainly become fully entrenched by tomorrow and Friday. So that transition will be a lot of fun at the office, I'm sure. I'm glad I'm not working at least until Saturday when it's all in, hopefully. But I digress. It's a flow pattern. You're going to get much drier snow as well, and maybe Simon will speak to this as well. But yeah, no, it's a flow pattern, and typically we see a few of these each season. Now we are in an El Nino year, and so typically El Ninos are warmer than normal, and I would say less likely to see these patterns. So we're seeing it this week. Are we going to see it again for the rest of the season? Maybe, maybe not. But El Nino is certainly tilting things towards probably not. But if we do, maybe only once more. So it's a little unusual to see it during an El Nino year, but we are seeing this is our first Arctic push of the season that we're experiencing right now, and this is kind of the pattern there. So, Simon, did you maybe want to add some things, I guess, about the Arctic pattern there?
Yeah, in terms of like the immediate impacts on avalanche conditions, you might get some low density snowfall, moderate amounts, but what really stands out with these patterns is we get often a good blast of wind from the north that can move snow around and form wind slabs, and often in kind of unusual spots because it's blowing the snow from the north to south over ridge lines. And that's what we're expecting to happen today and tomorrow as this, with the initial movement of the Arctic front coming down through. And then in the long term, if you have prolonged periods of very cold weather, that can facet and weaken the snow that's on the ground, potentially causing a problem afterwards.
Cool.
Yeah, Ross, in the Q&A here, we have a question from Troy that maybe you can explain the strait effect for large bodies of water with the Arctic outflow.
Yeah, so different poll question, but if there's anyone from Southern Ontario or has lived near the Great Lakes, perhaps from Buffalo, there have been some epic snowfalls when Arctic air comes down through Ontario and picks up the moisture off of the Great Lakes, and they get their lake effect snowstorms. And there can be some epic ones there, especially near Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, depending on the flow pattern and the fetch that the wind across the water. So the amount of time the wind is blowing across the water to pick that moisture up. We are not immune to that here on BC. We have our own quote unquote lake effect snow, and that's strait effect snow across particularly Georgia Strait, coming and spilling out of the inlets of the mainland inlets, through Howe Sound or Jervis Inlet, some of the inlets that are along the mainland side, as outflow winds spill out and across the strait. And if you're on the east side of Vancouver Island or in Victoria, you can be quite susceptible to some of these streamers, these strait event or strait kind of snow events, where it can pick up a lot of moisture and dump a lot of snow very quickly in a very narrow area. It can be very localized, but this is something that happens when the Arctic air arrives. I suspect it's something that will happen with this event as well. And so anywhere, say on Eastern Vancouver Island or Victoria, is certainly under threat of seeing some of this happen within, say, the next, as this event arrives, as the Arctic air arrives along the coast. I'm not sure of the particular forecast, how they've worded it in the actual forecast, but yeah, no, this is something that does happen. Famously, my grandparents moved actually from Ontario to Victoria in 1996, and if you do have a memory of Victoria, December in 1996, 96 was a particularly snowy year, and all I remember my grandpa saying they gave up their snowblower when they moved to Victoria, and then they had 2 feet of snow on the ground just after Christmas, and he was wondering why he gave it up. So yeah, it's a nice favorable area for the strait effect snow, with the Arctic air coming down. Good question. We'll go one more pattern here, and this is the upper ridge minimal flow pattern, El Boro. Although the joke that sometimes is said is that meteorologists do their best work under high pressure. And if there was an applause button, I'm sure I would hear it right now. But anyways, I'm sure you're all laughing, hopefully with me, not at me. But anyways, what happens when there's no flow? And in this situation, you can look at the 500 millibar animation and the flow pattern, and you see the tighter lines of the black lines where the steering flow is actually kind of over northern BC and through the Yukon. And there's not a lot of flow over BC, what we would refer to as an upper ridge of high pressure. So high pressure aloft at 500 millibars. What this translates into is not a lot of not a lot of air movement. And when there's not a lot of air movement, there's not a lot happening at the surface. And when there's not a lot happening at the surface, this is the situation where a lot of fog can form, a lot of valley cloud, especially in the winter, can form. We have very low sun angles. This valley cloud can be somewhat persistent, depending on the time of year. Again, especially being in winter right now, we again don't have a lot of we don't get a lot of the solar input, so that valley cloud can really persist. And these are patterns that we do get into. They can be somewhat persistent too. Once we do lock into one of them, sometimes they can hang around for several days, and so it can be, the valleys can be really plugged up with valley cloud. Now, of course, if you get above that, it's you get into a lot of sunshine, which has its own issues as well. If you're expecting maybe cloudy skies, and you get through the cloud and you break through into the sunshine, and you're like, oh shoot, now I'm going to get toasty up here, and so it's minimal flow patterns can be conducive to valley cloud and that sort of thing, and fog. So from an avalanche perspective, maybe I'll let Simon kind of chime in there as well.
Yeah, there's kind of two interesting points with this pattern. One is in the immediate impact on avalanches, we usually are looking into warming effects. So in the winter months, most of that warming tends to be on the south-facing sun-exposed slopes. You might get heightened conditions there. And then later in the season, that warming impact can be anywhere with above freezing temperatures. And then when these happen during the winter, it's often when we see persistent weak layers form. So I already mentioned possible warming on the sun, on south aspects can form sun crust. And you can also get really good kind of ingredients to grow surface hoar, a combination of clear skies as well as warm, humid air from that valley cloud. This is often the conditions where we see those nasty surface hoar layers form that, once buried, can become quite a tricky avalanche problem.
Cool. Awesome. So those are kind of the 5 patterns that we've kind of identified. Again, westerly and a southwesterly atmospheric river. So active pattern in atmospheric river, perhaps the upslope pattern from the northeast. And then we've got our Arctic pattern, generally a good push of Arctic air, which we're seeing right now. And then no flow, minimal flow and an upper ridge. So again, so if you kind of identify which pattern we're in, you can kind of at least have kind of guide you towards perhaps getting even an earlier handle on what those conditions weather-wise and avalanche-wise might be. So some additional tools, and I think, Brent, we're going to put some of these in the chat, but some of these are really good links, depending on how much you want to nerd out with the weather, and we are living in a fantastic age of data. So on our Avalanche page here, we've got a lot of good stuff that we'll look at, and this is again real-time data, radar, satellite, and temperatures. We've got some of the different model fields that are there, including the mountain weather forecast, 12-hour precipitation, and that sort of thing. And then I share with you as well a variety of links that are really good and available on the internet. The first one is from something called the College of DuPage. They have what I would refer to as maybe excellent satellites and satellite images right across North America, and fantastic to look at. University of Washington has a great radar page, which is really, really nice to see. And then other, say, model viewers that are really good to look at, and I think Simon might mention them when he does his kind of trip planning and good daily process to go through. But there's some really good ones there, like Spot Weather and Windy and the Tropical Tidbits. So some really good ones in there, and nerd out. It's there's lots of information there. So
one question there, Ross, with regarding like spot weather and snow forecasts and stuff like that, how do you feel like regarding their web forecasts and stuff? We've had a couple question in the Q&A. People are just curious of I guess the validity of those sites, like, would be my guess.
For sure. Yeah, so they don't necessarily do, say, a straight forecast. So when you're viewing their data, you're kind of viewing just raw model output, and that's with their visualization as well. So, it's a model. It's what the model is thinking the forecast is, or what the weather conditions are going to be at that particular time in the future. So it differs from, the expertise that we apply at Environment Canada, where we're able to look at multiple models, ground truth them, make sure that they're handling perhaps the situation well. And not all models are the same. Depending on the resolution, it's maybe able to pick up different features versus others. A challenge that's in British Columbia in particular, and again, it's not to go all numerical weather prediction model on this tonight, but if folks have questions, I'm happy to talk. But one of the challenges that we do have, one of the basic ones we do have in BC is we do have these things called mountains and some topography and varying terrain, and significantly so more than really any other place in Canada. We are, at least in Vancouver here at the Weather Office, the experts with respect to mountain meteorology. One of the limitations with models is they can resolve the features well enough, but if you look, say, closely at, say, how they're resolving winds right near, say, particular inlets and straits like Howe Sound, Jervis, you might see that the winds are not, perhaps capturing things properly, and that's really due to challenges with the terrain and interactions with the terrain. That's one limitation with the models, and that's, I would say, if you're using just taking the model up verbatim, that's the pitfall you can fall into and say it looks so real. I'm going to go with it, but it may not be resolving things properly. And so that's where we encourage you, obviously, to step back and to look at it. And Simon will do so, but of course use it in concert with the mountain weather forecast and the forecast with Avalanche Canada. So that's maybe my longer answer there, but keep checking the mountain weather forecast and Avalanche Canada forecast. With that, maybe Simon, do you want to go through your daily process?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So I'm going to talk a bit about how to apply this weather information that we get from the mountain weather forecast, and start just purely how that fits into the avalanche aspect of planning a trip in the winter backcountry. And then a little more broadly, just about kind of any outdoor activity, some of the more general things to consider. So in avalanche skills training courses, we teach this daily process, a structured way to plan a safe and fun day in the backcountry. And it's broken down into the before the trip stage, during the trip, and after the trip. And the first part of the before the trip is get the forecast. And by that, I mean get the avalanche forecast for where you're traveling to, because the big goal in the before stage is to plan a trip that's appropriate for the conditions. And so when we get the forecast, often you'll quickly look at the danger rating and hopefully the avalanche problems to understand a bit about what types of avalanches we're worried about. But it's also important to think about the fact that this forecast is for a large region and it's written the day before you're going out. So there's a lot of what's written in there depends on what we're thinking the weather's going to be the following day. And so I'd recommend, when you're looking at the forecast, to go to the details tab and look at the weather summary section. Ross, can you click? Because in that, we write a very simple forecast for the entire region, broken down into the main factors that can impact the avalanche danger: precipitation, wind, temperature. These are what we're basing the forecast on. And so for the reasons I mentioned, when you head out the next day, you might not experience these same conditions. And so the first step when you're in the field in this daily process is to observe the weather and verify the condition. And if the snow or wind or something's not lining up with the forecast, be prepared to adapt your trip plan based on what's actually happening with the weather. And that's a very simple approach of how weather directly plays into the avalanche forecast, thinking about how you can pick safe routes. But then obviously we've talked a lot about how there's a lot of other ways weather comes into play. For one, you want to be able to pack appropriately for warm clothes, sunscreen. you want to ideally try to find enjoyable places to go, whether that's deep snow, or if you're going for a hike and on a mountain and you want to make sure you have good clear skies. You're not going to get necessarily all these details just from the avalanche forecast, but this is when you can go into a little bit more of a deep dive into the mountain weather forecast and learn a bit more about what's happening actually in terms of weather systems and flow patterns. Next slide, please. And so a nice approach when you're looking at the weather for planning a trip into the outdoors is to use what we call the forecast funnel. This is an approach used by professional meteorologists, as well as pretty much all avalanche forecasters. And the idea here is you don't just quickly pull up a point-specific forecast from a model in the place you're going, but instead you do kind of a sequence of looking at first the bigger scale picture of what's going on. Next slide. So that starts with the continental scale, looking at a big image like a satellite to see where weather systems are located and where they're moving. And then going down to more of the mountain range scale, and then finally applying that to your local area terrain. Think about what's happening. So a lot of these resources you can find at the avalanche.ca weather page. For the continental scale, there's a number of links to satellites. For the mountain range scale, the day 1 and day 2 tabs actually describe the impactful weather happening in each of the major mountain areas of Western Canada. And so this should give you some good context about what general types of weather there is by looking at where there's strong flow, what direction it's coming from, where fronts are and where they're moving. And this gives you a lot more ability to interpret the local scale information when you do look at a point forecast. So to get that local scale, you can certainly look at what's happened previously with weather stations and webcams. Those are great. But if you want to know kind of from a planning point of view what's happening next, that's where it's nice to look at a model. And Ross shared some of these link ideas previously. Spot WX and Windy are two of the more popular sites where you can drop a pin at a map and potentially choose which forecast model you want, and it'll give you kind of specific hourly values of wind and temperature. But you can definitely get a lot more information out of that if you know why it's showing those values. And that's what you get from doing this forecast funnel approach, of knowing that the precipitation in the afternoon is coming from a front as opposed to more of a scattered pattern. Yeah, and with that too, it's a really good tool to learn pattern recognition, seeing how the flow patterns and the more bigger scale features impact your local area. You can definitely get a better sense of how to expect weather in your area. I know when I moved to Kimberley about 5 years ago, it took a few years to kind of learn how each of these flow patterns impact every valley around here a little differently. And if you want to kind of become a real weather guru in an area, it takes following this approach and linking up what actually happens at the local scale with these higher scale things. Next slide. So finally, a lot of professionals and weather keeners and more advanced recreationists will take some notes about the weather before they head out. And this is just an example of kind of a notebook where you take down some notes following this funnel process. You can write a quick synopsis, what kind of flow pattern there is, whether there's a front in your area, and then fill in some values for some of those key weather variables. Next slide. And this is a nice way to kind of practice your weather assessment skills and kind of have an idea before you head out the door. So at the end of the day, when you're reflecting, you can think about whether it played out as you expected or not. And of course, packing these other things. So to summarize, we talked much about the mountain weather forecast. It's a great product, and I encourage you to read it as often as you can and poke around and find different tools in there that you find helpful. And think about it in terms of recognizing weather patterns, the flow direction, which Ross and I talked through. These kind of ideas are quite helpful for both understanding weather and the avalanche conditions. There's lots of additional tools out there as well. And then I just we wrapped it up by talking a bit about this forecast funnel approach and tying it into the daily process of avalanche planning. Thanks, everyone. Happy to answer some questions.
Great job, guys. That's fantastic. I was just typing a little bit of an answer here, but I think it'd be better coming from you guys. What are a few simplified takeaways that can help us identify patterns to help build confidence in our attempts to start nerding out and forecasting? Like, for example, we hear about high and low pressure systems and ridges a lot in the forecast synopsis, but what characteristics do they have that can help us visually identify them more easily when looking at a weather map? And, with those patterns, what are they commonly associated with a low and a high?
Yeah, so at least from the weather perspective of that, yeah, looking at, say, the 500 millibar, like that's a really good just big picture snapshot of where the main flow is coming from for the province. So looking at the 500 millibar map, and those are available, of course, on those other websites as well. Windy and Spot and other model viewers have their 500 millibar patterns as well that you can look on there. But the nice thing about the Avalanche Canada site is it's actually, I'd say it's one of the cleaner images to see this kind of flow pattern. So go to the mountain weather forecast, have a look at that synopsis page, and see where the winds are coming from at the mid levels of the atmosphere, where the flow is coming from for those weather systems. And again, weather generally from west to east and following those lines, the black lines on the 500 millibar chart there. That'll certainly get you started. The other one to maybe look at a big satellite image, and those are on the again on the tabs there. And maybe I can just step back actually if I can. That was my daughter. You may have heard that. She's very excited about weather too. So you can click on some of the real data. So maybe start with the 500 millibar on the synopsis page, and then maybe jump to a satellite image, and you can actually let the satellite loop. And if you let it loop and you just watch it for a couple of times, you can just see where these weather systems are coming from and get an idea of, is it a westerly flow pattern, or are we thinking maybe a little bit more of a southwest? Or maybe, again, maybe no flow, something like that. So that's what I would recommend, and that would certainly help build that pattern recognition and where that flow is coming from there.
Yeah, I'll add my initial answer was going to be the same thing: the 500 millibar geopotential heights, the black lines on the map, and I'll just say that for me, maybe it wasn't quite natural drawing my eyes to those. I always was looking for the yellow blobs of where it's snowing, where's the precip. That kind of gets your attention first on those maps. And it took a little while to get used to looking at those lines. But once I started doing that, I got like a much more complete picture and kind of had a full idea of how the weather was going to play out in different mountain ranges by seeing the flow patterns.
Nice. And so that's where I would start. Now, of course, you can totally nerd out, and the College of DuPage has fantastic satellite images, and definitely worthy of checking it out. But you really do have everything you need as a one-stop shop. It's really nice on the Avalanche Canada page.
Excellent, thank you, guys. Another question from Chris: how much does a thermal inversion affect the avalanche forecast, Simon?
Yeah, so in some ways, there's two big types of ways weather can impact the snow. It can either add load from like snow or wind, or you can add heat, which also can weaken the snow. And it can be a little trickier to say what the impacts of heat are on the snow. And that's what we see when we have inversions. It's quite obvious if you get a lot of new load on the snowpack, we expect conditions to avalanches to become more likely, but heat's a much trickier one to forecast. And definitely if we see above freezing temperatures, if we're we are thinking a bit about avalanches. If the snow is generally strong, we might be thinking about surface or loose, wet avalanches from that. But if there are any kind of deeper, weak layers, it becomes quite tricky to forecast whether they're going to become reactive with those inversions. And generally, we'll see in our forecast that being reflected with uncertainty in language. And generally, we recommend being cautious if there is a weak snowpack and above freezing temperatures in the alpine. We generally just play it more conservatively.
All right, now they're starting to trickle in. This is good. So Brady is asking, a couple webinars ago, the presenter made mention of viewing the weather station data on Avalanche Canada, that it's best to view it as charts view as opposed to the table view, but never really explained why it would be most beneficial. Do you understand what they may have been talking about?
I can take at least an initial shot at that, and just say, when you're referring to charts, it's I guess that's a very weather office thing to say. We'll look at it's just basically another word for say that 500 millibar map or that surface pressure pattern that's on the day 1, day 2. We'll look at the charts, and it's vernacular, I think, that's definitely used in the weather office, and perhaps it's gotten out more so as well. But looking at the charts of, say, 500 millibar, you can look at, and that's one particular one, and that's a very critical one for looking at the flow pattern. But in our meteorology, we like to look at actually multiple levels of the atmosphere to tell us, to kind of diagnose what's going on at different levels and to help us figure out what's going on. And so there are various charts that we can look at and different maps that we can look at, including, different ones from different pressure fields, such as 250 millibars, which would be higher up in the atmosphere, typically associated where your jet streams are. And then we can look at ones that are a little bit lower down as well, 500 millibar, which is good for the steering flow, and lower levels as well, 700, 850 or other common ones. Generally, pressure to height, 700 millibar is about 10,000 feet, and 850 is roughly 5,000 feet. So anyway, so I suspect it's good to look at the charts because it can really build visually a picture and perhaps a narrative of what's happening with the weather. I suspect as opposed to tables, but that's my shot at that question.
I think it might have been in context to the automated weather stations on the map.
Oh,
where it's showing kind of hourly data from the past few days from a weather station, and there's two options to view it. The default, if you click on a weather station, there's a table of hourly values of snow height, wind, temperature. But if you flip the chart, you simply put it in the line graph, and it makes the patterns a little more obvious of like when we had a peak wind event or when the snowfall happened. It's just a more visual, intuitive way to look at the actual data.
All right, one more from Mel. Any words of wisdom about El Nino and avalanche broadcasting?
I thought I was going to defer to Ross on that one, and then we got into avalanches.
yeah. Well, I mean, in general, the El Nino pattern, especially that we've been in this year, is, it tilts the scale, shall we say, for what the weather patterns that we're traditionally going to see. El Nino, I would say, and you've probably seen the seasonal forecast, I think was calling for an above average winter, at least here in British Columbia, and El Nino tends to result in above normal temperatures. And so I would say that tilts things in favor of, more systems that are coming from the west or the southwest and fewer ones that are coming from the north. But that, of course, is not to say that we don't see them. So how does, at least from a day-to-day perspective, El Nino impacts the weather in terms of maybe the types of weather systems that we see, but on a day-to-day basis, we don't really look at it too much. We're not measuring and say the El Nino signal is showing this. We're really looking at just day-to-day weather, but across the season as a whole, it is contributing to perhaps seeing more milder systems versus systems that may come down from the north. And that's as opposed to the winters that we have just experienced previous, I would say in 2021 and 2022, into 2023. Last winter we were in the opposite. We were in La Nina, and the typical winter that we would usually see with those is maybe it tends to be a little bit colder. And sure enough, that's what we saw the last couple winters was certainly more Arctic outbreaks and more intrusions of Arctic air and colder flow patterns from the north occurring than we have this winter. So, from the weather perspective, again, perhaps on the day-to-day basis, it doesn't directly impact us, but it does show, over the season, the amount of weather systems that we see this season. I would say we're not surprised that many of them are coming from the west southwest, at least initially through December, and again, fewer ones from the north. From the perspective of the Avalanche, maybe Simon, if you have words of wisdom there.
Yeah, well, the main theme is that really Avalanche conditions are more impacted by the day-to-day weather, not the averages over the course of a whole season. So that definitely is the more important thing. There's been some studies that have looked at kind of a season's worth of avalanche activity to see how El Nino versus La Niñas are in terms of general avalanche patterns. And there's some weak correlations, but it's not super strong. Kind of an anecdotal thing, I guess, though, is with comparing this winter with the cold weather in December last winter created a really weak snowpack that kind of set the stage for a really tricky avalanche winter. And this winter started off similar in ways in that it was a low snowfall fall. But the fact that December was so much warmer than normal, that snow on the ground didn't weaken as much as it did then. And at this point, at least, we don't have as concerning of a snowpack across most of the mountains because of that warmer temperature.
Good question. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, it looks like questions are starting to dry up out there. Yeah, anybody else got any questions out there? Give me another minute. You can get them into the chat box. Oh, it looks like you folks have done a fantastic job of answering everybody's questions tonight. So thank you so much, Ross and Simon, for that informative presentation tonight. Sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming when you're looking at those weather maps, but you've really pulled out some of the gems and the details and some of the simplicity of it that allow us to look at those weather maps. We got some great tools to use moving forward, and there's many layers to understand in the weather forecast. Some are more accessible to the folks out there that are just learning about weather. We hope this presentation gave you some insight to that, but there's also many aspects to dig into for more experienced folks. And there's always more to learn about weather. It's a never-ending process. I know from my experiences out there for sure. With that being said, folks, stick around. We got a couple prizes here in a minute. These webinars are a great starting point or a helpful addition to your avalanche safety know-how, but avalanche education is a lifelong journey and it doesn't stop here. The best way to keep learning and keep your skills honed is to take an Avalanche Canada training course. If you haven't taken any courses yet, the AST1 is the place to start. It's that minimum requirement that we think. If you've already taken the AST1 and you're spending more time in the backcountry, go get that AST2 under your belt because it's for you. There's also great options for training that aren't a full AST. There's companion rescue skills, which is a great course to take. Every other year, you hone on those skills. You're doing like a full day of companion rescue practice and stuff like that, keep fresh, check out our Cherry Bowl story on our website if you need convincing of that. Folks, they took a companion rescue course and actually happened to get in an incident, wasn't even a week after, and they were on it and made things happen. Another helpful course after the AST is managing avalanche terrain to give your travel skills a bit of a tune-up. You can take these courses as many times as you like to keep yourself sharp. Avalanche Canada training courses are run by folks who are vetted by Avalanche Canada and follow our world-leading curriculum. So be sure to check that your instructor is a licensed Avalanche Canada training provider. And we're proud to have a great variety and diversity of licensed providers around the country. So you're sure to find a course that's right for you. So with that being said, we're going to bring it on to Amy, and she's going to pull us a couple names.
Thanks, Brent. So our prize winners tonight are going to receive prizes coming to them from the North Face. And the prize winners are Brandon Bernadette, Camilla Suchamel, and Micah Simmons. So hopefully you're still tuned in. It's always good to stay online just till the end in case you win something. I'll drop the email in the chat so you can make sure you send us your name in an email. And also I'll drop in our Avalanche Canada merch link just in case you didn't win something, but you're looking for a new hat. Brent's got a good one on there. And yeah, with that, I'll pass it back to you, Brent.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Amy. Folks, we really appreciate your interest in Avalanche safety and coming out and watching these webinars. You can support essential programs here at Avalanche Canada by donating as little as $10. If you can afford it and would like to help, please click on the link in the chat box, scan that QR code on the screen right now. We'd super appreciate it. We are a nonprofit organization. Our next webinar, Wednesday, January 17th, Choosing Terrain for Skiers. This is a fun, interactive webinar. We'll have a little bit of thought going into that one. Gets you thinking about safe terrain, train choices, how you meld that together to go out and have a safe day out there. Pre-registration is required for that. So go sign up, check it out online. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight and showing an interest in avalanche safety. We hope you enjoy your winter in the backcountry, safe from avalanches, and we hope you have a great season. Thanks everyone and have a good night.